Hello, my name is Glenn Lipscomb. I'm a professor in the Chemical Engineering Department at the University of Toledo, and this is Lecture 0 for CHEE 1000, Orientation and Computing for Chemical and Environmental Engineering. The agenda for this lecture is to first of all present some information that new students may find useful, as well as students from other departments or programs. Talk about some of the student services that are available to you, then segue into talking about why engineering is important and of interest to you, hopefully, and to the general public. Then describe the engineering disciplines that have evolved over time, and then spend more time talking specifically about chemical and environmental engineering. Once again, my name is Glenn Lipscomb. You can reach me at this phone number, 419-530-8088. And my office is located in North Engineering 2424. Now to get there, it's a little bit of a difficult task, but what I'm going to do is try to show you how to do that. The engineering buildings are shown here. North Engineering here is the building that is to the north of the other two main buildings in the complex. Just north of Nitschke Hall, which is located here, these two are connected through this corridor right here. And then the classrooms, the room that will have our computer recitation section in, is in Palmer Hall, and that's down here. There's a big parking lot over here, which is probably where you will park if you could drive into campus. So just to orient you where these buildings are located. Anyway, to get to my office, you would come in through the doors here. That's one way to do it, at least. Go to the left into North Engineering, and then on the first floor, follow that blue arrow to the stairs here at the far end. Take those stairs up to the second floor, and then walk down the hallway, and my office is in a group that's down there at the end. Now, the TAs for the class have been announced. I have not put them in here yet, but I will introduce them at our first class. There's also a lounge for students to gather in. Now, we'll probably have social distancing in that area for this coming semester because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But this is a place that in future semesters, maybe not this semester, but in future semesters, you would want to gather and meet with some of your friends and some of your classmates to do homework. To get to the lounge, you'd come in through the same door down here, the door in between North Engineering and Nitschke, then walk around the corridor here, the hallway, and there's a door at the far end on the opposite side of where this arrow, where that point is right there. There's a keypad on that door. In order to get into this room, which is Nitschke 1069, you need to enter the code 1142. There are many services available to students here at the University of Toledo, and one of them is counseling. The Counseling Center offers both group and individual counseling in the areas you see here. Counseling related to stress management, eating disorders, anger management, for example. Also, you can seek support there if you're grieving or have just suffered a loss, as well as support for members of the LGBT community. Their website is provided right here. You can click on this link in the slides and be taken directly to their website. They're located in the main campus medical center, which is on West Rocket Drive. Their phone number is provided as well down here. And if you need help after hours with mental health services or with sexual assault education or prevention or concerns, as well as to directly contact the UT Police. The phone numbers for those are provided down at the bottom. Legal services also are available to students. The services that you can access are essentially those you would obtain from a general practice law firm. And you can see a list here of the things that they can help you with, from consumer issues to landlord-tenant issues, etc. Probably the most common issue that I've heard of that students use the legal services for is problems that they have with their landlord. Now, the website is indicated in the link provided there. They're physically located in the Lancelot Thompson Student Union, and underneath that address is their phone number. Now, if you pay the $10 per semester fee for legal services, you may open up 3 files per semester for free. And this allows you then to pursue 3 different items that require legal services. The university also offers a wide range of free tutoring services. These are provided through the Learning Enhancement Center. The website for that center is indicated here. It used to be that they would allow students to drop in and actually sit next to a tutor and work with them in person. But recently they've switched to an all-online tutoring model, an e-tutoring model. In order to access and utilize this e-tutoring, you will have to go to this website here that's indicated and register. And once you're registered, then you can set up a time to meet with a tutor virtually. So why might you be interested in engineering? And why might the general public be interested in engineering? Well, the reason for this is that society is facing a number of challenges to prevent us from living the fullest lives that we can. And engineers are well suited or well trained to address these challenges. The National Academy of Engineering was tasked with trying to identify what are the primary challenges that we face in the coming years. And this website down here is where they reported the results of their study. So the NAE, the National Academy of Engineering, identified these 14 different grand challenges that we face as a global community. And they range from issues related to energy production, things such as making solar energy economical, obtaining energy from fusion, and then can we use fossil fuels in a way that's responsible by developing carbon capture and sequestration methods. Other issues include managing the nitrogen cycle and providing access to clean water. These are sometimes tied together, especially when the nitrogen and fertilizer runs into the water and leads to algal blooms. That can make our water of unacceptable quality. Other areas of our grand challenges include restoring and improving the urban infrastructure, advancing health informatics, making better medicines, trying to understand how the brain works so we can make smarter computers, as well as help address brain injury, trying to prevent crimes such as nuclear crimes, nuclear terror, as well as crimes in cyberspace, trying to make virtual reality a thing that we use on a regular basis, which can be used perhaps to personalize learning and enhance learning. And finally, the last grand challenge identified was developing new tools for scientific discovery. Over the course of time, a number of primary engineering disciplines have emerged. In the future, I think there'll be new ones that will emerge at the boundaries between the 5 that you see here. But these are the primary ones right now. They are bioengineering, chemical engineering, civil engineering. And then this 4th bullet here groups together electrical engineering, computer science, and computer engineering. This is often done in colleges of engineering now. Those departments are all put together in one larger department. And the last one is mechanical engineering, industrial engineering, and manufacturing engineering. Talk a little bit about each of the engineering disciplines before we focus specifically on chemical and environmental engineering. In the bioengineering area, you'll see there are many different types of activities. People that have a bioengineering degree might work on biomedical engineering problems. The pictures that you see over here in the lower right-hand corner are images of artificial kidneys. These hemodialyzers are used to treat patients that are suffering from partial or total renal failure, kidney failure. And they replicate one of the primary functions of your kidney, which is to remove blood waste. In operation, blood would be taken from a patient and then passed through the port that you see right here. Inside this plastic tube can be anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 hollow fibers. The blood that comes from a patient enters into these fibers and flows from the right over to the left, say. As it flows through here, blood waste are removed by diffusion and transport across the fiber walls into what's called a dialysate, a fluid that is circulated around the outside of the fibers. This fluid is introduced through this port right here. From this port, it flows around the outside of the fibers and eventually will come out over here. As it flows through here, wastes that are in the blood are removed and accumulate in the stream that is removed from here. And the clean blood here goes back into the patient. What you see here are just a number of different designs provided by different manufacturers. So those with a bioengineering degree might work on biomedical engineering, design of artificial organs such as this. These are ones that you would not implant in a person, but there is work on producing implantable organs, as well as dealing with artificial bone, hip transplants, knee transplants, a large number of different areas. Another job that a bioengineer might be involved in is bioprocess engineering. One of the big parts of this is biotechnology and bioseparations, in which these engineers are involved in making the drugs that we use to treat disease. And then also they might be involved in bioinformatics, which is trying to make use of knowledge about the human body in order to design a better drug treatment regimen. Bioengineers are involved in trying to replicate human tissue in human organs. They're involved in trying to understand the nature of our genetic makeup, as well as the proteins that are produced by our genes. And then finally might be involved in the agricultural area and work as engineers involved in food production, as well as crops for potentially fuel and for other materials. Individuals with a degree in civil engineering might be involved in any of the areas that you see listed here. For example, they might be involved in construction engineering, which is the design, planning, and construction of a building. It can ultimately even involve the management of the structure. They might be involved in earthquake engineering, understanding how a built structure responds when the earth moves. Over here on the upper right-hand corner, you see a table that's used to simulate the effect of an earthquake on a scale model of a building. The building to the left, this building right here, you can see how it responded to the shaking, in which it was permanently deformed. Looks a little bit like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Civil engineers might also be involved in geotechnical engineering, understanding how the built infrastructure, buildings, interact with the rock and soil upon which they stand. This is of particular importance to a building in San Francisco right now. It's a condominium building that is slowly sinking into the landfill upon which it was built. Those individuals that paid several $1 million for their condo are not too happy with the structure right now. Structural engineering is designing a building or other structure that is able to withstand the loads that are anticipated to be put up upon it, as if it's a multi-story structure, as well as the roof. Understanding how to build structures such that they do withstand earthquakes, as well as winds that might come from a hurricane or a typhoon. Transportation engineering involves designing the transportation system, any type of transportation, from automobiles to the railways to airplanes, even to the waterways. If you look over here in the upper left-hand side of the pictures, there's two parts of civil engineering illustrated here. One is a structure that is designed to move boats from one waterway, say the lower waterway, to an upper waterway. This little channel right here connects the lower waterway to the upper waterway, but to get from the lower waterway to the upper waterway, first the boats must be moved up to this channel up here, and then they can flow down that channel to the upper waterway. So in this case, civil engineers might be involved in designing the waterways to allow movement of people and goods. They also be involved in designing these structures to permit that. The last area shown here is water resources. This is probably one of the primary areas of civil engineering historically, and that involves producing drinking water from a drinking water source, as well as treating wastewater. The last image over here on the lower right-hand side is that of a trickling bed filter, which is one form of wastewater treatment. It's not this particular image here is a small one, not a large commercial or industrial one, but similar technology of trickling filter beds are used for wastewater treatment at many, many different scales. Those individuals with a degree in electrical engineering or computer science or computer engineering might be involved in any of the areas that you see listed here. For example, electrical engineers might be involved in managing the electricity transmission grid that we have. Over here in the upper left-hand corner, you see a picture of a utility pole with multiple lines going through it. Managing this grid is of great importance to us, as we have come to expect uninterrupted power. There's growing challenges in maintaining this when as we bring online more and more renewable sources of energy, such as solar and wind, in which the power they produce is highly variable. Solar panels will produce electricity when there's sunlight, and they won't when there's not. Just like wind turbines will produce electricity when it's windy, and they won't when it's not. So how do you manage this variability in supply as well as demand is a great area of a significant area of interest right now in the electrical engineering community. Electrical engineers, computer scientists, computer engineers also are involved in control. For instance, how do you design a system to control the temperature in a refrigerator? They're also involved in producing what I might call macroelectronics, things like toasters and dryers, things that are large that involve electronic components. They're also involved in making microelectronics, things such as computer chips, microprocessors. A picture of one is over here in the upper right-hand corner. They're also involved in telecommunications. How do we manage the information flow that we have, both wirelessly and wired? How do we process signals? How do we take information and convert it into a form that we can send it from one spot to another? And how can we extract information from different signals? The picture here in the bottom on the right-hand side over here is of a radome. This is a structure that is designed to protect radar equipment, allow the radar to function in all types of weather conditions. And of course, radar is used for multiple purposes to sense the presence of, to sense weather as well as sense objects nearby. Computer scientists and computer engineers are of course involved in designing, building computers as well as the software that they run. Those individuals with a degree in mechanical engineering might be involved in the areas that you see here. These areas include mechanics, understanding how different materials can withstand different loads, their performance, their behavior under static conditions in which they're not moving. The performance, of course, is going to depend upon whether the material is a metal, a plastic, or a ceramic, and whether it's a solid or a liquid. Mechanical engineers also are involved in understanding kinematics. How do you design an object to have a certain range of motion, to move from one point to another, or to be able to transport an item from one spot to another? Of course, if you're going to build a robot or you're involved in mechatronics, you need to understand mechanics and kinematics, but you also need to be able to design the control system, the computer that's necessary for manipulating the object, so making use of its ability to withstand a load, to take a load on, and then to move it from one spot to another, or say to install a series of rivets or to make a series of welds. Mechanical engineers are also involved in structural analysis of vehicles, such as cars, planes, rockets, understanding how they respond dynamically to the loads that are placed upon them when they're accelerating, when they're decelerating, when they're under steady motion. Mechanical engineers also are involved in thermodynamics, understanding the fundamental properties of gases and liquids and solids. This is of particular importance in the design of engines. In order to optimize performance of an engine, you need to understand the thermodynamic cycle associated with the production of power from it. And there's an picture of an engine right down here. They're also involved in thermal science, which is the management of heat transfer. Of course, managing heat transfer is vitally important in a car. You want to keep the engine cool so it doesn't overheat, but it's also important in many other situations, a number of them involving transportation, but others are involving commercial manufacturing processes. I listed a few areas where these different disciplines have intersections, and the first that's listed here is nanomaterials. These are the design and use of materials that are that have nanometer length scales. A nanometer is 10 to the minus 9 meters, so quite a small length scale. For perspective, a typical hair fiber will have a diameter of around 100 microns. Now, a micron is 1,000 times, 1 micron is 1,000 times larger than a nanometer, and so 100 would be 100,000 times larger than a nanometer. So your hair is about 100,000 times larger than the materials we're talking about here. The environmental area really represents an intersection between chemical and civil engineering. Civil engineering got involved in environmental issues originally through water treatment. But now this is expanded to looking at issues related to air, as well as water, as well as waste disposal on the land. This is an area where there's a great deal of overlap with chemical engineering. And in fact, the environmental engineering degree program requires several classes from chemical engineering. The design and construction of medical devices is an area of overlap between bio and chemical engineers. Those that are involved in the design of those artificial kidneys you saw earlier was a mix of different engineers, primarily chemical and bioengineers. The production of drugs and pharmaceuticals also is an area of great overlap. If you use a fermenter, which we'll see in just a few moments here, to produce a pharmaceutical, then the fermenter is the equivalent of is a biological chemical reactor, and chemical engineers are trained in the design and operation of chemical reactors, and if they modify their design principles to account for the nuances of working with a biological system, then they can design and operate reactors for producing pharmaceuticals. But this is an area that there is overlap between those two different disciplines. And then in the energy area, whether it be with solar or wind or with production of alternative energy forms such as liquid fuels from biomass, from lignocellulosic biomass or from algae, that's an area where there's an overlap between all the engineering disciplines, chemical, mechanical, and electrical. Great deal of overlap. What you see over here is a pump that's providing an ethanol-enriched fuel, so that would be in the energy area. This image down here is of a train. These long tubes here are trains of what are called reverse osmosis modules. These are devices that are used to treat a source of drinking water to a level that's acceptable to drink it. This would be an environmental area that there would be an intersection between chemical and civil engineering. These reverse osmosis modules can also be used to treat wastewater to actually bring it up to the same quality that you could drink as your normal source of drinking water. In Singapore, they rely upon reverse osmosis for both desalinating seawater to produce drinking water, as well as treating their wastewater to produce a water of quality that it can be consumed again. If you think about our water that we consume, every single molecule of water that we consume most likely has been through a wastewater treatment system at some point in time before we consumed it. I'm often asked to provide a brief statement about what is chemical and environmental engineering. And what you see here is the tersest, most concise way I can think of trying to convey what we do for a living. What we do is take materials from the land, water, or air and transform them into something else. And we do this with the intent of trying to improve human life, something consistent with the mission of the University of Toledo, which is to improve the human condition. And we can't just do this any way that we like. We have to do it subject to environmental and economic constraints. For instance, if we pollute the land, water, or air, then we're going to destroy the source of our raw materials. We'll put ourselves out of business. Moreover, we don't want to use processes that have the potential to harm people, whether it be people working in the plant or people that live adjacent to it. We also want to produce products that won't hurt people in their use, nor will they hurt people or animals or the environment when they're disposed of. All those are important environmental constraints that we must work within. Additionally, we have to do all of this in a way that makes money, because that's the way we get paid. This slide illustrates some of the transformation processes that chemical and environmental engineers are involved in. The first is taking crude oil and transforming it into gasoline. This is the process that led to the emergence of chemical engineering as a discipline. The transformation process begins with separating crude oil into its different components. Some of the components can be used directly as a fuel. Others, what's left over, can either be transformed into fuel components using organic chemistry or potentially into other products that are of value. Crude oil also can be transformed into plastic. Plastic plays an important role in today's society, but it's also of concern when it's not disposed of properly. We're finding plastic in fences and in trees where it's an eyesore. We're also finding it in the ocean where it's not only an eyesore, but it's being consumed by sea life. When sea life consumes plastic, it can kill it, but it can also appear then ultimately in the food chain, in our food chain. Biological nutrients, in particular sugar, can be transformed to insulin using fermentation. We're going to see an example of a fermenter in just a few minutes here. Sand, so silicon dioxide, can be transformed into semiconductors, into microprocessors, into memory chips. These are key parts of modern communication, as well as our ability to obtain information through the internet. Finally, sugar can be transformed into ethanol. Ethanol is being looked upon as a potentially more sustainable fuel for transportation. The transformation processes that were illustrated in the previous slide are abstracted in what you see in front of you. This diagram is called a process flow diagram, or referred to as a PFD, or sometimes as a process flow chart. It illustrates the transformation of raw materials by some process into the desired products. And it's that transformation process that adds value. And it's that transformation process that allows us to get paid. I'm going to split up that transformation process into two steps. The transformation process typically involves a reactor, a transformer, that takes our raw materials and turns it into the desired product. Unfortunately, this reactor is not perfect. It doesn't transform all the raw materials into the product, nor does it transform all the raw materials into a single product. We often get a mixture of different products. So it's vitally important that we have a separator right after the reactor. The separator separates the desired products from the undesired products. Now, the undesired products can contain waste that ultimately will be disposed of as a waste stream, but it can also include unreacted raw materials that we might be able to recover and recycle back to the reactor. The undesired products may not have the same value as our desired products, but we might be able to sell those as well. So separating out the undesired products from the desired products is a key step. This slide illustrates what you need to know in order to design a transformation process. For example, in order to design the reactor, you need to know the chemistry or the biochemistry that's involved in that transformation process and the chemical reactions that occur. In order to design the reactor, you also need to know some chemical and environmental engineering principles. In order to combine the two together to design a separator that complements the reactor, you need to know chemical and environmental engineering concepts that you'll cover later in the curriculum. This slide illustrates one of those transformation processes that we talked about earlier. That's a process for taking corn and producing ethanol out of it. Now in this diagram, ethanol is referred to as fuel alcohol. When you go to the gas station and fill up, you typically are filling up with a blend of 10% ethanol and the rest gasoline. Now some parts of the country you can buy blends that are 15% ethanol, and in most parts of the country you can also buy blends that are 85% ethanol. Now to use this E85 fuel, you have to have a specially designed engine in order to avoid damage. The process for producing ethanol typically begins with the corn being transported from where it was grown to the biorefinery in a truck. Now the transportation can also occur by rail car if that's more convenient and is available. Upon entering the biorefinery, the very first the corn kernel is smashed. This is done in order to open up the corn kernel and make it easier to extract out of it that part of the corn kernel that will ultimately be converted into ethanol. So after being smashed, after being milled, that is sent to the next step, which is referred to as the cooker. In the cooker, the milled corn is mixed with water and an enzyme. In this case, that enzyme is alpha amylase. That mixture is then heated, say up to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, in order to what is referred to here as liquefy the starch and form a mash. Now to understand why this alpha amylase is added and why we have this cooking step, we have to talk a little bit about what is in the corn kernel. The corn kernel contains primarily starch. Starch is the food that we get out of the corn kernel that we rely upon for energy for our own lives. Now that starch is also what will ultimately be used by the yeast that we're going to add in the fermentation step in order to produce ethanol. Now starch cannot be used directly. The yeast, in order to produce ethanol, must be fed sugar, must be fed glucose. Starch is not glucose, it is a polymer of glucose, and starch is often referred to as a polysaccharide. Polysaccharide meaning many sugars. As a polymer, that you can think of this as being formed by taking a single glucose molecule and then reacting it, hooking it up to a second glucose molecule, then hooking up that pair to a third and a fourth and so on to form a long chain of glucose molecules, a long flexible chain of glucose molecules. And when we form these long chains of glucose molecules, you can produce one form of that type of polymer is starch. Now there are other types of polysaccharides and forms of polysaccharides, and one of the other most common ones is called cellulose. Now the corn kernel has primarily starch, but it also has a little bit of cellulose, which is often referred to as fiber. It also has a little bit of protein. It can have oils in it. And it can also have what's referred to as ash or salts in it. But it's only the starch that we're interested in. And we want to take the starch, we want to pull it out of the corn kernel, extract it out, and we want to take that long chain, this long polysaccharide molecule, this starch molecule, and then cleave off individual glucose molecules from it, because these are the things that the yeast in the fermentation step will be able to metabolize to produce ethanol. To speed up that saccharification process, you see the word here, saccharification, which means converting to sugars. But in order to speed that up, we'll add an enzyme that acts as a catalyst. And in the cooking step, we also will heat it. So heating it up will speed up the process as well. So the mash that leaves the cooker is then sent over to the fermenter. Now the alpha amylase has not completely converted the starch into individual glucose molecules. It's started the process. In order to fully saccharify the starch, a second enzyme, glucoamylase, is added. This is critical in order to get nearly 100% conversion of the available starch into glucose, which the yeast, which is added to the fermenter, can act upon, can metabolize to produce our ethanol. Now in the process of metabolism, the yeast will produce ethanol, but they produce an equal amount by mass of carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide that's produced can be vented or potentially can be collected and sold as another product. What leaves the fermenter here is called the beer. It's roughly 10% ethanol, and it's fed to a sequence of steps in which we separate the ethanol from everything else that's in the stream leaving the fermenter. Now, in the stream leaving the fermenter are going to be the yeast bodies, the microorganisms that we added for the fermentation. In the stream is going to be that part of the corn kernel that is not starch. So this will be the fiber, this will be the protein, this will be the ash. And there will also be the water that we're added in here to suspend all of this. So the very first step in separating out the ethanol is what's referred to as the beer column, and it's a distillation process. Virtually all of the ethanol is removed to the top of the column with a little bit of water. The stream that comes out the top is roughly 95% ethanol. Now the stream it would be great if we'd use that directly, we could blend that directly with gasoline, but unfortunately it contains too much water. So it goes through a second separation step, one that utilizes molecular sieves to absorb the water out and produce virtually a water-free ethanol product. Now you can think of these molecular sieves as sponges. Basically suck up all the water and leave behind the pure alcohol. Now most biorefineries don't store this as pure alcohol. You could store it and sell it as an industrial alcohol, or you could even potentially envision selling this as a liquor. But what biorefineries do is they add a little bit of denaturant, typically gasoline, in order to produce what is referred to as the fuel alcohol. And the reason they do this is that to store this on site, if they were to store it without the denaturant, there'd be much more stringent regulations in order to keep people from taking it, stealing it, and using it as a liquor. What's left over, what comes out the bottom of the distillation column, so we've taken the product from the fermenter, sent to the distillation column, ethanol went out the top. What comes out the bottom, what's left over, is called distillage. This contains all the solids, primarily the yeast and other insoluble components of the corn kernel. All that comes out the bottom. This is referred to as distillage. Distillage goes through a centrifugation and drying process in order to produce what's called DDGS, or distilled. This is a valuable byproduct from a biorefinery, from this ethanol plant. This is used as a feed supplement for cattle, and it can be a fairly high value byproduct. So in order to produce this, you have to take out most of the water. in order for this to be a valuable feed supplement. So the way the water is removed is typically in 2 steps. The first is just to centrifuge it, and the centrifuge will remove most of the surface water, but still what's left over, the solids have too much water in it, so it'll go through a drying step. So we use a fuel such as natural gas in order to heat up what's left over and remove the last little bit of water. And we also then recover from this process a liquid stream that will have whatever water that we've removed, as well as other components that were removed with the water, things that were soluble in the water. So this refers to the overall process. It shows you the overall process for producing ethanol from corn. Now I'd like for you to think for a moment about the general process flow diagram that we talked about, in which there are 2 steps in this transformation process. There is a reaction step and a separation step. So as we go from the milling, step 1, all the way over here to the denaturing step, which is where we produce our final alcohol, we're going to go through a transformation step, a reaction step, and then a separation step. I'd like for you to find at what point, which one, or to identify which of these unit operations, 1 through 8, lie in the reaction part of that general process flow diagram, and which of these steps lie in the separation part of that general process flow diagram. After giving it some thought, what we'll do is you can move on to the next slide. I want you to spend just a few moments thinking about it, so I'm not going to stop talking and allow you to give you some moments to think about it, because on the next slide we're going to show you where the transition occurs from the transformation step, the reaction step, to the separation step. This slide shows how I would divide these different steps and place them into either the reaction part of the general process flow diagram or the separation part. Inside this red box right here are all the steps I would put in the reaction part of the PFD, and inside this yellow is where all the steps I would put into the separation part of the PFD. And as you go from 1 through 4, 4 is the actual reactor, the fermenter. The steps before this are often referred to as a reactor preparation steps, but they're all associated with making sure that this reactor can operate most efficiently. What leaves the reactor contains our desired product and a number of potentially undesired products, and it goes through a series of separation steps: distillation, molecular sieves, and then centrifugation and drying, in order to produce our desired product, which is the ethanol, as well as the other undesired, or potentially other undesired products. This is really our desired product, the ethanol, but other byproducts that could be of value as well, such as the DDGS. In the next step, I'd like for you to think about this process, look at this process, and identify all the feeds to it. And one way to do this is to go through each of the steps, 1 through 8, and looking at arrows that go into the unit operation, the process that is associated with each of the steps. Each of the arrows that go into it represent a feed. I'd like for you to identify all those feeds, and in the next slide I'm going to identify them for you as well. The green circles that you see here represent all the feeds to this ethanol production process. And as we go from the first step, we see the very first feed, the primary feed is the corn, which goes into the milling step. In the cooking step, we have 2 additional feeds: alpha amylase, the enzyme to do the saccharification to produce glucose from starch. We also add steam in order to heat up the cooker. In the next step, we add another enzyme, glucoamylase, to further saccharify the starch. We add yeast, which is the microorganism that does the conversion of the glucose into our desired product, ethanol. In the distillation step, we add more steam, because this distillation step requires energy in order to heat up the liquid to produce a vapor that comes off the top containing our desired ethanol. In step 6, we have in 6 and 7, an additional feed is the denaturant that is used to make our fuel alcohol, to make it so it's not drinkable. And we look at step 8, we also add fuel here in order to dry the stillage to a point that we can produce a DDGS that's suitable as a feed supplement. What we're going to look at next are all the undesirable products that are produced by this. And you can identify these undesirable products, or not our primary desired product. When I say undesirable products, these could potentially be of value. We can sell them potentially, but they may not be, they are not the ultimate desired product. We designed this process in order to produce one primary product, and which is, of course, is our fuel alcohol or ethanol. But a number of other products that are produced, byproducts that are produced in this process. So I'd like for you to take a moment and try to identify those. Of course, those are going to be arrows that come out of each of the different steps of this process. You should be able to identify those pretty easily. In this slide, all of the undesired products, or shall we say the byproducts of this process, are circled in red here. And you can see they include the carbon dioxide, which is produced on an equal mass basis as our desired product, the ethanol. We also have as undesired, potentially undesired, or byproducts, industrial alcohol, the recovered liquids from the DDGS production process, as well as the DDGS itself. Now, it's probably best not to look upon these ultimately as undesired products or as waste, but as potentially valuable byproducts that we can sell. For instance, this carbon dioxide could potentially be sold to a company that uses it for manufacturing a product. One of the Andersons, a local company here, one of their ethanol plants, they sell their carbon dioxide to a company that makes dry ice being solid carbon dioxide, which is used for cooling, for refrigeration. So for them, this is a byproduct that's very valuable. Of course, all of the plants sell their DDGS as feed supplement for cattle. And there's some parts of the country, there's been stories that when ethanol plants have been forced to close for various reasons, is that when the supply of DDGS stopped, is that the farmers in the area were all upset, were very unhappy, because they no longer were able to rely upon the biorefinery for the DDGS as a feed supplement. They had to look for other sources of feed for their cattle. Now I'd like to finally show the desired product in this PFD, which is the fuel alcohol here, our ethanol. And that concludes a discussion of this particular transformation process. I want to briefly just talk about the fermenter and its design. What's shown here is a cartoon, a diagram of it. And over here is an actual physical device that was constructed. Typically, these devices are made of stainless steel like this, especially in the pharmaceutical industry. But if you were to look inside here, what you see is this is just a giant cylinder, open cylinder, into which there's this shaft that comes down, and to the shaft are attached blades, and the shaft rotates to mix the fluid up in here and try to achieve a uniform concentration. And with a uniform concentration, you get the greatest productivity of ethanol and the greatest utilization of the reactor space for ethanol production. In fermentation, as these microorganisms, typically yeast, convert the sugar, the glucose, into ethanol, they also produce a little bit of heat. So often you'll have a cooling jacket around the fermenter in order to maintain the temperature so it doesn't heat up too much, which will have an adverse effect on the yeast. They can only operate effectively within a fairly narrow temperature range. And so this cooling jacket will have an inlet for the cooling water down here, and then an outlet for the cooling water. And then in order to maintain the temperature inside here, there will be a temperature controller. This controller is hooked up to a sort of temperature sensing device inside the tank. And it'll decide how much cooling water to allow to flow around the cooling jacket in order to keep the tank at a constant temperature. Here is a line to allow you to introduce the medium. In this case, it would be the mash that was produced from the previous step, from the step prior to the fermentation step, as well as introduce the additional yeast and the additional enzyme. And down here at the bottom is a line from which you can harvest the products that are produced. And commonly there'll be also a vent on the top here to allow removal of CO2. That concludes our first lecture, Lecture 0. Next time, in the next lecture, we'll be talking about units, unit conversions, and calculations, the proper way to do calculations. And I'll start in on the technical content of this class. Until then, bye.